for anyone who doesn't know me, I am Stella and I am one of the directors at CoverageBook. CoverageBook is a reporting tool for everybody in PR, and I can send you some details about that later if you're not already a user of the tool. But we're not going to be going on about that. Today is about how we can adapt our approach to selling in a sensitive way so we can still get coverage. So, Rick, it'd be great to just speak to you right now. And yeah, can you give us a little bit more information about 72 Point, about your roles there and why you are in this unique position?
Sure, yeah, thanks, Stella. So hi, I'm Rick. Thanks everyone for joining. I'm head of editorial at 72 Point Inc., based out of New York and been here for about 4 or 5 years now. We specialize in earned editorial coverage, as you've mentioned, and the way we most frequently do that is through data-led news, using insight to create really valuable talking points and garner media attention in a way that brings great talkative content in a timely fashion. Prior to that, I spent 6 years in the SWNS newsroom. So as you've mentioned, for those of you that aren't familiar with 72 Point or SWNS, stands for Southwest News Service. They're an independent press agency, so much like a Reuters, a kind of PA in the UK or an AP. They're, a large news wire. And so, like you say, we kind of pivot on both sides of the news world at the moment. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what we're experiencing in this time from a news providing content point of view, but also from dealing with brands and securing coverage from a branded side of things.
Cool, thank you. Daniel, what's your role at 72 Point?
Yes, I am the head of distribution, head of media liaison at 72 Point. So me and my team, we handle all the outreach, both with our news stories that are on our wire, and then also our research stories, as Rick mentioned. And before that, I was a journalist, editor, designer for more than 10 years. The last role I had in media, I was the director of content in charge of the audience team there. So the homepage team, social media team, the designers, the interactive team, and then for some odd reason, the photo gallery team. And then before that, I was just an editor at the Daily News for a while. Before that, I was a reporter, working at local newspapers and then some national publications. And so it's kind of like going into this role at 72 Point in SWNS, I kind of use my experience in media to help kind of make journalists' jobs easier. And I think it's, we're really good at it. And my team is great at outreach and also making sure that everything is in a position with these projects that it's just really easy for them to pick up and plug into what they're already doing. And that's a little bit about me. And thanks for coming, everybody.
Thank you. Right, I'm just going to share my screen now. Can you see that okay, everybody? Yep. Okay, great. So as the guys explained, they're in a really interesting position of having that sort of both sides. So we're not going to be going through tons and tons of slides. Don't worry, this isn't death by PowerPoint at all. Reason for that is because this is a changing situation. The information that the guys are going to be sharing with you today is literally hot off the press. I'm sorry. But so we have a few examples that the guys are going to talk you through, and then really I'm going to be asking questions, and we're definitely going to save some time right at the end for as many of your questions that we can cover too. A couple of house rules, as I've mentioned: if you've got Q&A, stick them in the Q&A section and I will be going through those. If we need to, there might be a poll during this, so you can use the raise your hand feature. And also, if you do feel you want to share anything on social from some of the stuff that you're learning, please feel free to. We are happy for you to do that. On the screen right now are our Twitter handles. And also, it might be useful for us all if we're sharing this information to use a hashtag, which is PRPivot. This is going to be actually a series of webinars and podcasts. So this is the first one in this time of like how we can pivot in PR. So we'll always use that hashtag. Okay, so I want to go to Rick actually, first of all, and ask the question. If I can get to the next slide. Yeah, like what has actually changed so far Obviously we are within the pandemic. It's been a few weeks. What have you noticed so far on the news desks that has changed?
Yeah, well, I mean, yeah, the impact is substantial is the short answer. The New York Times article recently had it an estimate at 33,000 news media employees that have been either furloughed or laid off in America. So that's a huge and significant number. We know that local journalism has obviously been really heavily impacted, and the declining ad revenues is obviously a massive part of that. Where advertisers are still advertising, there is a problem in the industry that most brands do not want to be positioned alongside COVID articles. So obviously that's a huge part of the news output at the moment, and brands will obviously, understandably, place blockers alongside their content appearing, in against words like crisis, pandemic, national urgency, things like that. So that means a lot of the content is struggling to be monetized, where revenues already haven't been pulled, which is a big problem for the industry. And that's leading to, reduced spending across the board, tighter budgets in an already struggling sort of industry, as we're well aware. The Times article gave a good description about trying to cover COVID-19 in this sort of climate is like, they used the phrase drinking from a fire hose. It's just all consuming, they are throwing resources at it. Those that haven't been furloughed or moved around, have been transitioned to cover breaking news where they might not have before. So everyone is kind of scrambling a bit to do a great job. Obviously different outlets are affected in different ways. So, obviously the way we've been affected might be slightly different to news outlets themselves. But, I think what we're covering in terms of our content now is primarily COVID. Everyone will say that's dominating the news agenda. And with our COVID material, that mostly ranges from the really grim, we've got pictures out today of kind of, overloaded morgues, hospitals inundated. We've got photographers in IC units shadowing in Manhattan, all that sort of harrowing stuff. And then you've got the kind of the other end of the scale where you've got the kind of human face of it and the kind of lighter stories. So, you might have the incredible recoveries of people in their 90s or over 100. You might have the heartwarming reunions. You might have things like the funny stuff like the isolation home haircuts and the content that surrounds there. So there's a real plethora of material that's being distributed by news agencies and that we're seeing engaged with the Newswire. Obviously the charitable acts and things, we've seen a lot of those and they're getting great news coverage as well, and rightly so. Another part, is the non-COVID material, and there is still a lot of that. So, we're doing a lot with animal stories, anything that can cheer people up. Seems to be a dogs on brooms type phase. There's a lot of those coming through. Science is still, led stories. It might be data around Alzheimer's or dementia and things like that. And anything kind of human interest that can bring a bit of relief. And then of course, Tiger King. So we're all devouring Netflix currently. We had a great exclusive for the Mail a couple of days ago. Carol Baskin's ex-boyfriend has come out and given an interview with us, and very bravely, in my opinion, and so that's made really well. So there's a lot still happening. I don't know if we could jump to the new slide, please, Stella.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you. So yeah, I mean, the other thing to mention is that the journalist roles are changing. So in terms of what we've experienced, and our journalists, certainly this side of the Atlantic, we're experiencing less story tips. So if you can imagine, we're all now indoors. There's less organic news being captured. There's less people out with their phones and getting videos. Yeah, they're still submitting some stuff and kind of incredible, fun things that they're doing at home. But there is an absence of that kind of news where previously there was a lot. Obviously things like courts and jury proceedings and things like that have slowed massively. Celebrity news is of course only coming from their direct channels. There's not really the sightings and the spottings. So there are certain streams that have dried up. Obviously, everyone's going towards the COVID effort, but that's just an idea of how the journalist roles are changing a bit. A bit more, a bit fewer sources on the non-COVID stuff for sure. And with that budget tightening, we're also seeing, less ad hoc purchasing. So we're a newswire. We're quite fortunate in that we do have a lot of great relationships with the desks and long-term subscriptions. So hopefully that means we're in a place where we can ride it out a bit. People might have paid us for our content for, the entire year, for example, which means they're able to dip in and use as much of those stories as they like. We're seeing our download and usage rates, on our new stuff is higher than ever. But obviously our ad hoc purchases, where people might pay us for a set of photographs, $500 here or 1,000 there or whatever, that is obviously and drying up. So, with that side of it, it does mean that hopefully newswires are in a good position because they still are a reliable source for those news desks. We had questions on the UK differences, didn't we, as well? I know we've got a lot of people from the UK watching.
Yeah, there's as I mentioned right at the beginning, there are people who are watching in a few different countries, Australia, UK and US. I know that you guys are working in the UK and the US. Is there a big difference between the news agenda and and how strategies are having to change?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's core similarities. Obviously, readership is at record levels still in the UK. I've checked in with the news team and the 72 Point UK team regularly. Newspaper sales obviously have been hit really hard, and the same thing with the ad revenue. I think I read that print revenue for ads was down 80%. So, that's a huge figure that they're having to deal with. If we could jump to the next slide on the PR stuff. So, I know certainly from the UK team with the 72 Point stuff and all the fantastic work they're doing, there was requests from the news desks to have light content and uplifting content. And I think that harks back to what we were saying about revenue spends and printing adverts in the paper. Those advertisers that are still there equally do not want to put their paper ads next to, if you've got an advert for a sofa sale at the weekend, you do not want that next to body bags and morgue pictures and COVID and that sort of thing, fairly understandably. So I think that, there's been a lot of contact from the desks on lighter, more relief type news to fill the second half of the paper. Obviously, COVID dominates. Obviously, depending on the day and the size of the paper, the first 15 or 20 pages would be nothing but COVID in various lenses, but I do think that there's still room, in the later stages of the paper to find relief and to include those non-COVID stories. So yeah, they've been having great success with coverage on non-COVID stories just as much as the COVID stories. So things like home DIY and kind of list-based stories, they've said from a brand point of view have been doing really well. They also had SWNS editors come over to them and mention about advice pieces. So, newspapers want to give their readers relief as well as information. They care about their readers. If we've all been fatigued by the news agenda, you pick it up and you've probably reduced your news intake a little bit. They want to ensure that doesn't happen. So they want to make sure they give people help and help them navigate as well. So anything about that, access to experts, all really relevant.
Okay, and so with all of that in mind, how has strategies sort of really needed to change with that? So has there been anything that needs to be added or taken away?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think, we've seen a lot of on our stories, and I'm not a PR, I will preface this, that we deal mostly in stories and what's going to work, what's not. We've seen stages with our clients and with their PR strategy. So obviously there was a taking stock stage. Everyone wanted to see what was happening. We had the kind of letter from the CEO stage. And now I think, once people have sorted their absolute duty to their staff, to their customers and getting that safety side first, I think now they're really mobilizing. We're starting to see a lot of content come through, a lot of stories going out. It's Earth Day today. We've been inundated with stories, which has been great. So I think that kind of organizational confidence is restoring. I think what we can learn from that is that for me, it really is about understanding what your storytelling is as a brand, using this time to really find out where your kind of relevance is. There's a phrase going around which has been said a lot, but relevance is the new reputation, and I think that's absolutely true. It's that insight and that time to really understand your company and how it's changed in this very unique time, and that comes through many ways. It's not just necessarily data and surveys, of course, but it's also through your internal insight, learning your customers' habits, looking at buying habits and things like that. What social indicators are there, so that you can tie into bigger trends. I think it's really important to sort of dig deep. Mining the stories is something that I always want to say to more PR people, that we know that there's golden stories out there. It's such a traumatic time, but there's a lot of really, really fantastic human stories going on, and it happens everywhere. It might be a delivery driver that's going above and beyond. It might be someone who's never missed a shift in 27 years and the pandemic's not going to stop. Anything like that, where you might have good human stories that you can mine. I think now's the time to do that.
Something you just said about that's really trying to be relevant to people right now. Obviously, with public relations, that's something that we always try and strive to do, but it is a new level of insight that's needed now, isn't it? Because things have changed. I know that from, as some people might not know this, but as well as CoverageBook, we have another tool, an insight tool called Answer the Public, and we've seen like record numbers of people using that tool to try and understand what people are searching for and how they're feeling right now. And it is that sort of new level of, okay, we might have done some insight in an insight phase at the beginning of the year, but now we just need to redo it. We need to redo research to understand, have that deeper level of understanding.
Absolutely, yeah. It's shifting so rapidly. Yeah, it's changing every week almost. So it is really important to kind of ensure that you're engaged with your consumer base, but also on a national level, if you're aiming for national coverage, you've got to have your finger on the pulse of what people are doing, beyond maybe just your private agenda of what the brand's goals are. So it's that ability to pivot. I don't know if we could jump to the next slide. Well, I do know. Yeah, we can. Thank you. In terms of glimpses into behavior and things, I think that's really important. But what we're doing with stories, and this is specifically to 72-point stories, but I think it is applicable. Some of it, it doesn't need explaining, but we really are focusing on stories, not press releases. I think that it's really that time to make sure that you're giving great content, and it sounds cheesy, but earned editorial has to be earned. I think that's a key point. Now is not the time to try and hard sell or come off as self-serving and insensitive. And it sounds obvious, don't be insensitive, but actually it does require a lot of navigation, because there's different dynamics and stories. Daniel will go into that a little bit more, but there's so it's not necessarily as easy as it sounds. But authenticity, I think, is the thing, head to toe in the copy. So not just doing a good first 5 pars, but making sure that the quote support and everything else is strong. And I think that empathy, of course, is absolutely crucial. That goes without saying. But can you really highlight a problem for audiences that, again, go beyond just the company, but can you tap into a wider social trend? Make a journalist feel this is important, they want to write about it, or provide reassurance, as we saw with the UK stuff. It's really important right now. And benevolence, I'm not saying give away everything or kind of throw your product out for free, but what can you do to help? So we've seen in the UK, the desks are getting asked for helpful advice or access to experts or anything for readers there. So I think anything you can give, or things you can team up with, or any sort of innovations there, will really play well. And then sort of evergreen, I think that we don't know what's happening. It is changing constantly. Don't put all your eggs in one basket and assume that we're going to be in the same scenario in 2 weeks' time, or if you're working on a more long form campaign, you've got to make sure there's stories that can be relevant and strong at any time of the year, obviously still having a kind of that relevance for right now. So it is sometimes a difficult balance, but that's what we kind of aim for.
And somebody's just asked a question, which I did actually say in the rules that we'll ask the questions at the end, but I think it's quite relevant for now, and it might be for you, Rick, or Daniel. Bethany's asked, like, what kind of percentage non-COVID news are news desks seeking? I mean, can you put a percentage on it right now? Is it, or have we found it's just a mix?
You want that one, Daniel? No, it's very
yeah, sure. I mean, I would say the majority of what they're covering is going to be COVID related, even in all beats. So like the lifestyle reporters are maybe doing it, looking at food, or looking at families, or looking at, you have the entertainment reporters with so many celebrities who have been positive, or so many celebrities that are being really like, open on Instagram and so many live shows, and they're covering that aspect of it. And then you have the sports people who are covering, the fact that there aren't any sports, but there are also athletes who've been positive. There are athletes whose family members who have died. There are managers in the UK who've been positive, right? And all over the place. So there is a story there too. As far as it not being COVID related, I think it really depends on the publication. If it's somewhere that is a real large national or international publication, they're probably doing mostly COVID. And what they are doing is uplifting, like Rick said, or something that's kind of not going to be perceived incorrectly. But then at the same time, you get to think they're still all covering the things that usually would be happening this time of year. It's Earth Day. I'm sure some newspapers have, and there's tons of stories about climate change, mostly maybe with a COVID angle. How is everyone staying home and doing less traveling and doing less driving, and how does affect the efforts toward that? But as far as putting a percentage to it, I think it would be tough. But I would say, less than 10%, I think is a safe guess. I think the majority of it is either the hard news, the business side of it, or the other lifestyle kind of lighter things. But I'm sure that there are people who are writing things that aren't related, because, in my experience covering big, what they call them, like catastrophic type events, whether it's like a mass shooting, a hurricane, a tornado, a wildfire, right? Like if you remember Australia, remember when everyone thought that was the most important story? Like in December and January. Has anybody talked about the Australian wildfires since then? Probably not. But it's, you cover it until you reach a point wherever you're just doing the same stories every day. So they're always looking for something different. And I think as things start to kind of go down, or as things start to get better, you're going to see more and more non-COVID related stories coming up. But always as well, if it's still happening and it's still there, that's probably going to be their main priority. And you should think about that and consider that in any outreach you do.
We're going to come on to that, Alyssa. We're going to expand on that point actually a little bit later with some examples, so which would be great. So, Rick, did you have anything more that you that you've seen sort of like from we'll talk about relevance and like needing to adapt a strategy and how you actually go about that with research. What kind of level do you think people need to do that? Because obviously, like when you add research to a PR campaign, that's normally done like quite near the beginning at the planning stage. I mean, and it seems like quite a big part of the budget, and it needs extra planning. But this seems like it needs quite quick turnaround. So is that even possible? And is that what you guys are doing?
Yeah, great question. I think, it is doable very quickly. We do fairly quick turnarounds where needed. We've revisited a lot of our stories and assessed them to make sure, we feel they're timely. Where we feel they could add with, benefit from supplementary data, we have run, added material to make sure we've got stuff to work with, and that we've got a very interesting comparison to make in terms of what was happening at the current state and previously, whether it was done 3 or 4 weeks ago or whatever the research was done. There is the ability to do things quicker, but also I think it is just about making sure that you do have that relevance and that kind of strong talking point. So you've raised the Tubi story here that we did very recently. This one went out last week. It's just a good example of how having data-led headlines in particular make for an engaging article, and how how it kind of can sow a quite open topic into a sort of finite focal point that will allow people to embrace and engage with. So it's quite a simple hypothesis. People are streaming more in lockdown. That seems fairly obvious, but the reason it works well is because we're giving that fine point of comparison. We're putting data towards it. 8 hours a day, that is interactive. Some people will think that's way too much. Some people will be like, okay, not too bad. We've all had bad days with Netflix telling us that, are you still watching 5 times? So, 8 hours a day might not be too bad. So it just gets people engaging with the research. And I think it gives that nice snapshot of a behavioral trend. Daniel will enlarge on this a bit more, but, there's also within that story a load of different strands that mean it can be qualified for different sectors. So not everything needs to be seen as directly COVID news, but within that story we're sort of hitting all branches, and this one did make exceptionally well. You can see there you've got your New York Post, LA Times, Fox, people.com, and beyond. I think it made over 200 pieces, fantastically displayed in CoverageBook, of course. So yeah, and I think really in terms of that, just reiterating, it's about tapping into that bigger trend. It's about giving brands a kind of good voice and a platform in a non-self-serving manner. Tubi could have released their own figures, I'm sure, on readership, on streaming being through the roof. I'm sure they have the figures to show that. But by conducting a kind of independent story, it allows them to be a bit more of a commentator, to give authority and lend quotes to a really interesting talking point, and then bring in their unique insight and what they're experiencing. And we find that journalism and journalists and news are kind of a bit more receptive to that, and it seemed to take well. So yeah, we're very happy with it. And I think, the final thing about insight and just really, having relevant research at this time, is that we're all going through this, really huge, weird, scary thing. And it's a very isolating time. But we want that glimpse of what's happening next door, we want that feedback. And so the snapshots and use of data, I think more than ever, whether it's a bit more frivolous like this on streaming or on the kind of more heavyweight stuff, is so important and really lends to journalists picking up the pen a bit. So yeah. So
just
helpful.
Going back to the slide, I was hoping to elaborate a little bit on that, what Rick was saying. You'll see that at the New York Post right there, that they have their like coronavirus widget right there that's tracking their main stories right next to this story. So it's relevant. It's a story that they put on their homepage because it's something that they have all over their homepage, right? And then you see, when I was an editor and I used to do the editorial meetings, we would do about 4 or 5 a day. First one's at about 9:30 in the morning. Then you have one right before lunch at kind of 11, 12 to find out what was happening for the stories before. Then we do one at 3. Then we do one after the first deadline at like 9:30. And hopefully I wasn't still at work at 9:30 p.m., but sometimes it did happen. But the reason why data-led stories are so great are because they're talkers. Like whenever we would have those editorial meetings for when the features editor would talk, they would always have a couple of polls, and it would instantly get the editors talking. Oh, that number's too high. Oh, that sounds about right. Or, oh, the other thing that once you have the data, newsrooms have the ability to find the humans to kind of verify or add that human element to it. You have the expert quotes that came from Tubi, but I can actually, as a reporter, go and ask people, so are you streaming like crazy? And you get some good quotes to really add filler there. But when you have the data, you have a nice kind of base for them to be inspired, and also to really kind of talk about it. And it does great broadcast coverage too for that reason, because a lot of anchors like to like say there's this new study and then they talk about it on air. And hopefully, if they do their jobs, they credit who did the study. But yeah, this one did exceptionally well, and just wanted to bring that up to add on to what Rick was saying.
Yeah, I think this was the coverage that I noticed when I got in touch with you guys. It's like, this looks like you're not struggling to get coverage at the moment. Daniel, I want to go back to, you just quickly mentioned about having the edit meetings. What else? I know that you're an ex-journalist, you've worked at News Corp and Daily News, but I wanted to know from your experience right now with working closely with journalists, and I know that you're still in touch with a lot of journalists and editors at those publications. What has changed for them? Like, are they working from home? What else has changed that we need to be aware of?
Unless they're like a runner is what they call it, like somebody who goes to events, maybe going to the hospitals or live press conferences. Yeah, I mean, what has really changed? Most of the same things that have changed for you. Right now, journalists, editors, and writers, they're working from home. They're doing virtual meetings. They're having those editorial meetings on software like this, like Zoom. And actually probably having more people at those meetings than they used to be in a room that only had a limited amount of chairs. And they're having these meetings in the morning. They still have to plan out the stories they're doing, whether it's the main bar, the main COVID story, or how the business desk is covering it, or how the lifestyle desk is covering it, or how the entertainment desk is covering it, right? And they're meeting every day and they're talking about the stories. And so they're certainly looking at pitches. One thing I think to be aware of is that they're probably publishing less on the weekends. And it's always good to have, copy that's ready to that's an AP style or in their style that really is an inverted pyramid or something they could really easily plug in and plug out. I have some editors at some publications, they use us for that. On the weekends where they have less people publishing, they will put up a survey story that they have scheduled, because a lot of places have the technology now. Also, I think that, we do a lot of what we call error in story outreach when somebody doesn't credit, where the research came from. And we've seen a lot of people responding to those emails and that outreach because they're at home and they're logged on working from home. And so they're easy to make quick fixes, whereas before they might be moving on to another thing.
That's interesting. So you found that they've actually, in the last couple of weeks, been more responsive because they're at home.
Yeah. Also, we really kind of pull out all the fluff and the pretend to be your friend. We really get to the point, and that's based on my experience with being pitched as an editor. I appreciated the PRs that really, were a resource and not a nuisance, not people that were trying to, butter me up, but were simply saying, hey, I know you do this. I got this great thing. You should take a look at it. And just being really straightforward and to the point. And I think that a lot of journalists, especially now that they're so busy and there's less of them and some of them are working, the staffs are smaller, they appreciate when somebody really just gets out of the way and lets them know, is this useful for you? If not, let me just go away.
Are you asking, and I know that every journalist and editor is going to be different, this is a personal preference, but when you're getting in touch with people, are you asking them how they are, like on a personal level during these weird times, or are you literally just going over the story? Because, we're all getting emails and messages from different people at the moment, and some people are saying, I hope you and your family are okay. I don't know. Are we past that stage now? It's tricky, isn't it?
It's kind of like, it's like when it's a new year, how long do you wait when you can still say Happy New Year, right? If it's like January 30th and I haven't emailed this person yet, can I say Happy New Year? I think it's kind of that same thing. Like, it depends on the relationship. If you know the person, if it's cold, and you honestly believe and want to know and hope that they're doing safe and well, which I'm sure a lot of us, they really do feel that way. Sure. Like, be genuine, be real, but then at the same time, don't overdo it. Don't act like you care when maybe, everyone has an incentive and everyone has a job to do. And, I think the sooner you get to, how you can help, the better. And the other thing that this slide that's coming up now that's great is that, when I was a journalist and the journalists I worked with, I never shared anything on social media that I wasn't proud of. Or that I didn't want other people to see because my name is next to it, right? And so therefore, and journalists are pretty addicted to Twitter. A lot of them do their pre-reporting on Twitter. You see the threads of them kind of going through their stories. It's how they share their stuff, but then also they get very personal. And so the people that you're reaching out to, it's not the end of the world to follow them on social, to see what they're sharing, to get an idea of the stories that they really care about and that they're working on. And then if they see one, they shared something that you helped them with, well, you have every right to reach out and say, hey, I saw this. This is great. Thank you so much. And, hope I can be of help in the future or something. But I think that it really depends. And I think you should be, careful about what language you say, because we have some people go back and it's like, I hope you're safe and well. It's like, well, who cares about me? What about all these? There are other journalists who are kind of sour and they're feeling cooped up and stressed. And my advice to my team is to always, apologize and try to help. I think, which is really great advice, especially if you send something and then someone says like, oh, I really think this might be kind of insensitive. Respond and say, yeah, you're right. Thank you so much. I'm sorry. Is there any way that you think, we could maybe have it not as insensitive, or you're right, maybe this isn't something for you, and just being honest about it and not trying to force it and kind of what I call newsjack, which is hijack a news cycle. I think people appreciate that. The other thing we spoke of before, which I wanted to talk about, was that when somebody responds to you, you should respond to them, especially if there's an ask, as soon as you can. They're on deadline, and the sooner you get back to them and the more you are helpful or you help clarify something that they had a question about, I really think that they're going to appreciate that more. So I certainly did. When I was in newsroom, you'd always hear reporters saying, I'm just waiting on this PR to get me this stuff back, or this public, the communications person for a politician or police officer or whatever, what have it. And the ones that were really receptive and got back immediately and helped solve everything as quickly as possible so they could get out of the way and that writer could meet their deadline. I think those are the ones that build the best relationships, and they're more likely. Certainly, whenever someone helped me, I remembered them the next time they emailed me. So I would take a look at what they had to say because they were helpful for me. So.
Yeah, especially during this time when they've still got the same deadlines, they're still meeting with their editors at the same time, but they're working from home. It's like extra pressure. So if you can be that resource, it's probably going to really solidify that relationship in the future, isn't it? You talked about being a great resource, and also if you get that kind of, you said you're working with your team at the moment about, and sort of saying, if you get that feedback from a journalist to say that was a little insensitive, just be like, okay, listen, let's adapt.
Yeah.
And when we had the conversations, right, there's a slide up at the moment, which is something you said to me the other day about, stop and asking yourself, is this going to hurt or is it going to help? And that's not just like with how you approach the journalists and the communication, but also just with the angle, right? So we really need to be thinking about whether it's not only COVID related, but how is it related? And what should people be thinking about there?
Yeah, just to kind of reiterate a little bit what Rick said, be smart and have empathy, right? So just think about it. Think about all the language. If you have something that you think may cause friction or be insensitive, be received the wrong way, it probably will be by one person or another. And so, it's better to be super safe than sorry. It's there are things to avoid when it comes to story angles, and it's just kind of things that might be a bit obvious, but maybe not. And it's travel, right? Vacations, any events like concerts or things that people would have gone to, or cons, right? Like for the comic book nerds, things like, even things like, parties, or how many people would you have over. Those are all things, if you can't have a party unless it has a specific, like maybe a video conference party angle or something, you probably don't want to have that angle, right? And then also even things you think might be relevant, like food or grocery shopping, you have to be very careful about the language you use, because there are some people who don't have food. If you look at the stories about the food banks and the lines that they have all across the country, because there are people who are either unemployed and they can't. And if you're writing a story about how everybody is just like eating their favorite snacks, and you don't recognize that, you come off as insensitive. And I would just say that if you ever do, as you said, get a reply from a juror saying, yeah, I don't think you should let them know that they helped you. You're right. I'll certainly think about this going forward, and I really appreciate you letting me know that. I'm sorry, and I appreciate you letting me know. Like, it's okay to be wrong, I think is one of the things that when it comes to story angles. And if you get it wrong, you know how to do it. And the other thing is, iron sharpens iron. And this is actually, will show you that when you do data-led research, like we do a lot at 72 Point, the slide that's up here now, you wanted to have a lot of depth, you wanted to have a lot of different angles. The main angle that got a lot of pickup, as you saw on the previous slide, was about the number of hours people were streaming, but there was also data in there about our parents letting their kids watch shows that they did before, or watch more things, right? And then it had, and then also you see Pop Crush picked it up twice, and it had nothing to do with Justin Bieber or Black China, but in there, they were able to use the data that kind of as a section of those two pieces to kind of be like, oh yeah, and this is also happening, right? And then you have Motley Fool, which is a personal finance site that is writing about how Netflix stock is just exploding right now, and they needed some data about how people are streaming. And even though it's not in the headline, it's not the main thing, they do use the data to help buttress and supplement. And I think that's kind of the coverage and the angles that you could see. If it isn't going to be the lead item or the main part of the story, it's good to have things that can really just plug in and help out on things that journalists are already covering. And by kind of doing your research and knowing where you're going to be sending these things to, and the things that these people are covering regularly, you're able to kind of prepare and have things ready for them, so you can be a real resource.
Yeah, and just to jump in there as well, because a good thing about that story and for Tubi as well is the ownership of that space as a brand. That story will be written about in kind of a year's time, in 2 years' time. I can guarantee you we'll still be seeing coverage hits for that, because people will be writing about what's happened and kind of talking about streaming and the changes in the cycles. And like Daniel said, and the Motley Fool, where they just wanted to talk about Netflix or another type of streaming habit, that story, the first thing they do is search for prevalent news items on the topic, and so that will still continue to generate good exposure for Tubi. So that's another benefit of those stories.
That's a really good point to make, actually. Somebody, I'm going to bring up this question in our question time, but someone has brought up budget, which is a really, really good point. At the moment, budgets have been cut; they are tight at the moment, but PR is continuing. But maybe if we do need to look at finding budget for extra research, extra data. Maybe there's other budget pots where we can sort of like dig into, maybe, who knows.
I hope so. With the ad rev spend and brands tightening on their advertising directly, hopefully they'll move that budget towards earned editorial spend. I think that's where strategies might go, but that's hopeful, obviously. But
yeah. I keep hearing just different scenarios in different areas. Daniel, just so we do have, just checking the time, we've got 15 minutes left, but somebody actually brought this question up in the chat as well. Does everything, and then we have sort of covered it a little bit with Rick in the strategy, but just if we are selling in a story, should it always have a corona? I think you said like about 90% of the stories that you've seen out there are corona related.
Yeah.
Is it like a rule or not?
I would say absolutely not. I mean, it wouldn't hurt to try and like see if it fits, but like, you really shouldn't force it if it doesn't make sense. Because I think that, it actually looks a lot worse if you're trying to pitch something with a COVID or Corona angle that doesn't really have any connection. In fact, like if you just take a look at Twitter, journalists are tweeting out examples of ridiculous pitches that they're getting. It's like, they're like, hey, it's Corona. So like, I don't know, like just random stuff. If it isn't relevant and is in a way that makes sense and makes you look like you're trying to help, you're not trying to take advantage of the situation, I would say don't force it. Not everything has to be. And then we had some stories that aren't Corona related, that may be more uplifting, or things that that wouldn't be received in a bad way, that certainly did well as well. We have stories about superheroes, for example. I think we have a slide. I think it might be. Yeah, here it is. So here's a great example. This was a travel company, and not a great time to be a travel company, but this was a travel company we worked with, and this story did incredibly well. They were in Anaheim. They were going to have a convention, and it got canceled and postponed, but they still had this data about superheroes, and it was very, light, entertainment-y, feature-y, not related to COVID, and it did quite well because I think there were a lot of places that made it related to COVID by writing a lead like, the world could use a superhero right now, and America's favorite superhero is still Superman or what have it, right? And this one also is a great example of what I spoke of earlier. When you get some feedback, initially when we started setting up this out, we had some stats about people looking forward to going to conventions, people looking forward to seeing that, going to comic book stores and stuff like that. And so we kind of pivoted and reworked it. And then we took out those things that could be seen as insensitive, and then we did our outreach with this as the lead angle, and it wasn't COVID related. And this kind of went out right before the lockdown happened, and then it continued to do well after. And it just kind of shows that not everything has to be about this, but if it isn't about this, it has to be something that could still really connect and has an evergreen general interest that creates conversations and between the journalists, editors, and also their audience being like, oh, I like Batman better, or I like Thor better, or whatever it may be. So I think this is a great example of how it doesn't have to be, and how you can do something that isn't, or that maybe had something that could have been seen as insensitive, and you can still change it and make it work and still get coverage for a brand or a company that you're doing PR for.
It's great to see the both examples, both sides. What I'll do in the follow-up email to everybody is maybe share some of that coverage so people can have a closer look. There has been a couple of questions around the literal communication to journalists at the moment in terms of follow-up. Somebody asked, should it always be email? I think we can just say straight yes right now because
yes,
working from home. Yeah. Cool. And also, is there anything else in terms of the follow-up, or like how are people more? Another question came through about, are journalists inundated at the moment? Like, are they busier right now? How can you cut through the noise? Whether it's subject headers or whatever, I don't know, but
we always try to write our subjects as if it's how a headline would write. Me being an experienced headline writer and having former journalists on my team that have written headlines, and understand SEO and things like curiosity gap is what they call it. It's a euphemism for clickbait, right? So what we try to do in our outreach is really have the data and a good headline in there so they can, so that an editor, because these people are reading and writing headlines all day. And so a subject that is kind of informal, if they see something that looks serious and reads like a good headline that you would see, and if they like the headline, we've had times whenever we send outreach and someone steals our headline from the email, and that's fine. That it was a good headline, right? I think that when it comes to communications and how your communications should change, I think the first thing you should do is do your homework. Look at when you're putting together your outreach list, look at what these people have been sharing on social, look at what these people have been writing about. You might have someone that used to cover parenting that is now only covering like families and COVID. And you should know that before you do any outreach and before you send anything. And the other thing is, like I said, you just really need to be straightforward and honest. Be a human, sound like a human. It's okay to wish someone well if you actually mean it. And it's a hard time for a lot of people. But at the same time, people are still working. And so you need to be sending those emails and doing the follow-ups. I would say if somebody read your email and they didn't respond, don't follow up more than once. Don't bother them. They are busy. They are getting a lot of emails. And so, and then really, really figure out who you have in your outreach that you have a good relationship with, that you can kind of cut through the noise and be seen first. I think that another thing that's great about our projects is that understanding their style. We write, having been in a news company, we have already copy that's kind of in a style that they're already writing AP style and inverted pyramid, and understanding that and making it easier for them. If they're doing so many stories a day and they're able to rewrite copy that's more in their style, they're certainly probably going to use that more than something that is very pluggy, very brandy. And when it comes to quotes, you want the quote to sound like something a human said. It doesn't need to be something that has words that nobody would ever say out loud. It needs to sound like somebody actually said it, because they're going to have name said. Back in the day, we used to be prohibited from using email quotes because of that reason, because they were so edited and tailored. Now, a lot of newsrooms, even before this, they don't care about that. Before we don't have to get quotes on the phone, or we get quotes in person. But now email quotes are kind of the standard, and it makes sense because a lot of people work from home. But if you have quotes that really add value to the story, they're more likely. And when it comes to that too, you always got to be ready if they want more. When I was a journalist, we took a class where every day we would get an old press release, and we would have to annotate it like a poem, where you would basically try to be like, it was like the tortilla, and you had to fill in all the holes and put all the stuffing inside. And so that's something that journalists are trained and they do actively, and they're going to have a lot of questions. And if they have questions, you need to respond quickly and efficiently, and make sure that you're going to be a resource to them.
I think the point that you meant that you said about a quote that needs to sound like a human has said it. It sounds like a really obvious point, but I know that from when I was on the PR side, we'd always be shaping those quotes, and they'd be obviously based on what somebody has really said, but you would edit it and then send it on. And I know that it's like, because I have a podcast. When I first started, I wrote through the introductions that I used to do, and then I would almost like try and read out to a certain point my introductions, and it's so obvious that it's been written and it's just not how you would speak. And I guess that's the point you're saying. It's just like literally say it out loud what the quote, and make sure that it sounds like a human has really said it. Go on.
I'm sorry, there's just one more thing about communications I really wanted to say, was also to talk about how great my team is at this, is using each other. Having someone else look at something you wrote, it can't hurt. Collaborating with each other. And we've been doing this a lot on Slack, where someone will put in a draft they have, and then we all just going to say, what about this? What about this? What about this? And then, iron sharpens iron. And so if you have something you're going to send, if you have the ability to send it to someone, maybe even someone that you don't work with if you're independent, but someone you trust, whose opinion you trust, and saying like, hey, is there anything in this that you think might be bad or good or insensitive, considering the current climate? I think it's a really good thing to do, is to really ask as many people as you can before you take the plunge.
Okay. I'm keen to get to some of the questions because there has been a lot that have come through. We don't have loads of time left. So attendees, we're going to try and get through as many as possible. If people are happy to stay on for a few minutes afterwards, we will try and cover a few. But yeah, there's lots that have come in around sort of the follow-up and around the communication. There's one here around press release and pitches. Should there be press releases being sent right now, or because of what you said and around pitch being on email, working a lot better, should the press release just be left? Like what's the ideal? I guess that's to Daniel.
About the press, whether a press release, I'm sorry, you cut out a little bit. Can you
sorry.
It?
So yeah, Alicia has said, would you rather, so from a journalist perspective, would a journalist prefer rather a press release, a pitch, or both? Additionally, should we pitch healthcare reporters with non-COVID stories? So it's two parts.
I don't think you should pitch healthcare reporters with non-COVID stories. That's my personal opinion. They are probably really, really overwhelmed, and specifically on one beat. I think even if you had a healthcare reporter who covered a certain sector, it's probably pretty hard to get their editors to let them write that long form healthcare story right now that's not related to this. So I would say, no, you probably don't want to pitch a healthcare reporter or something that's not COVID, unless it's something uplifting, maybe something that's like a side effect of this, like maybe some other disease has really kind of disappeared. While this, I think there was actually like a smallpox vaccine or something that came through. I can't remember which, but things like that, maybe. And as far as between a press release and a pitch, and if I wanted the press release, I would ask. I'm sure that most press releases are public, so you could link if your press release is up somewhere on the site, on your site, one, it adds some value. They might be, link back to that later in their story. But I would have a pitch with a link to a press release, because press releases, they kind of, before, back in the day, we just used to have a fax machine that would be running all day, and there would be so many press releases in there. And as a kid reporter, it was my job to really grab the stack and have to go through things and then flag things for the editors on whether it was interesting. But a pitch, I think, something that really cuts through and is hey, I know you cover this. Here's something that's great, and making it easy for them to find any assets or any additional language. The shorter the email, the better. Honestly, get to the point, 3 key data points. Maybe if you have a data-led story like we do at 72 Point a lot. And the other thing is too, if you are having a hard time figuring out a way to get, your company or brand coverage, we're here to help. We're very good at kind of knowing both sides, and we're happy to help anybody out there that maybe has an idea for a campaign that's COVID related or not, that's trying to get coverage. So.
On the research point, because we have mentioned it a few times, because that's the successes that you've experienced with for getting your stories covered. I brought in some of this question earlier, but a couple of people brought up budgets. And I think we're going to be sending out an email after this with a bit more details. But is there, is research expensive? What can it be done in a smaller way, or does it need to be sort of big, thousands and thousands of people being researched? What kind of level is there? I mean, we can send stuff out afterwards if it's easier, but.
This is a good question for Rick.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I think it depends on the story. It always goes back to the story and what area of insight are you looking at, There's some stories that could be done on five really well worded, well crafted questions. There's other things that topics that demand a kind of 20 or 30 question survey, so it is a bit story dependent. But as we've seen, it doesn't, if the data point is strong, we took the 2B 8 hours point, you could have crafted that from a relatively small number of questions. And yes, research does tend to be a little bit more time consuming and kind of expensive in the wider industry. But I think, obviously I'm going to say it, but we're very competitive and fast moving. We know that it's about reacting to an ever-changing news agenda. So yeah, I think it's definitely an option to consider. And like Daniel's saying, if where we position ourselves as a creative team, sort of sat between the two fields of news and PR, a lot of our time is working on just giving advice, and we brainstorm for free, and we will give feedback on what people are using for their campaign. So a lot of brands use us as a sounding board before they run any material, and we'll come back on that. So yeah, it's good for that, to use us as a bit of a sense check.
It's really useful. As I mentioned, we will be sending out a follow-up email with the recording of this, but also all of our contact details as well, in case anyone wants to get in touch. There's quite a few questions around different sectors. One sort of just came in because it's quite an interesting one, and I'm not sure how much insight you've got here, but do either of you have any predictions around the travel desk? When will stories resume? Is it likely to be in the near future or not? Have you had any insight?
Yeah. Despite plane tickets being cheaper than they ever have been before, I don't think people are going to be doing much traveling. And then also, the people who cover travel, they're probably covering it in a way of how nobody's traveling. And as far as when it'll get back to normal, I can't even predict what the weather's going to be like tomorrow, let alone when people are going to be traveling again. But then there's different types of things, right, that you could do. There's a lot of virtual, vacations or something like that. And then you could always do when things are back type of kind of stories. We've done these before, even before this, where it's kind of I guess the term bucket list isn't really appropriate now. changing the communications. But you know, kind of like the dream list of like when this is all done, do you have a list of places you've always wanted to travel to that you really going to make sure when you can that you're going to do that? You know, things that are hopeful and uplifting when it comes to travel, of being kind of like when it's all back. And then also, you know, it'd be very interesting to see how the travel industry is affected by this. You know, it might be a way for these places that generally rely on tourists and tourism as a big part of their local economy or their budget, and the companies that have been built because of that, how this is affecting them and what their plans are. And it might be good to do some outreach and homework with them, that you can really get a good idea of when things might be back to normal. What are they saying, following what the industry is doing and what they're saying when they're hoping things will probably get back to a place where it will start going back up. I think all of those things, you know, but otherwise, if it's something where you're trying to sell for people to like get on cruises or to take trips, it might not be the best time. And I think that if you can wait, you should. And I think you should wait, and you can wait, and you definitely should wait, because it's going to come off as you pretending like nothing is happening when everybody in the world knows that something is happening, and to pretend like it isn't, it's just not a good look.
Thank you so much. And guys, we have run over slightly, so we're going to draw those questions to a close. There are some that we didn't get to answer, but maybe if you really need those questions answered, maybe jump on Twitter and see if our guests might be available at another time to be able to answer those. But thank you all so much for joining us today. I know that it is a tricky time, and we're all working very hard to try and keep things moving. We actually are going to, as I mentioned at the beginning, this is the first webinar for this kind of topic about pivoting in our PR world, in our strategy. We wanted to do this one first because people are selling in right now, but we've got another webinar next week, same time next week, where I'm going to be joined by an insight specialist around looking at how we can use insight to change our strategies. And I mentioned a tool called Answer the Public. It's going to be sort of looking at that. So yeah, join me on that. But today, Daniel and Rick, thank you so much for taking the time out of your busy sellings, by the sounds of it, and sharing some of those insights with everybody here. It's been really, really amazing. Thank you.
Thanks for having us.